The rain in Chicago did not fall so much as it hunted. It came sideways off Lake Michigan in cold, slanted sheets, the kind that found the gaps between collar and skin, that soaked through suede and wool and resolve alike. On a night like this, the city wore its sins openly. Neon signs bleeding color into puddles, headlights cutting through fog like searching eyes, the distant wail of a siren sounding less like emergency and more like grief. Ilara Voss stood beneath the inadequate overhang of a corner bodega on South Wabash, her umbrella a casualty of the wind 2 blocks back, her blazer clinging to her shoulders in dark, wet patches. She had $43 in her checking account, a broken heel on her left shoe, and a very important job interview at 9 tomorrow morning, for which she desperately needed to not look like a drowned woman pulled from the river. She checked her phone. The Uber was 7 minutes away. 7 minutes was a long time when the universe was apparently determined to remind her how fragile everything had become. She was 28 years old and rebuilding from rubble. That was how she thought of her life now. Not as a failure, because failure implied a singular event, a single catastrophic moment of poor judgment. What had happened to Ilara was more like erosion, the steady, patient wearing away of things she had taken for granted. Her job at the architecture firm, when the recession hit and junior staff were let go first. The apartment she'd shared with Daniel when Daniel decided, 6 weeks after the layoff, that he needed space to grow into his best self, which turned out to mean a woman named Britt who taught aerial yoga and didn't ask difficult questions. Her savings had lasted 8 months. The temp agency work had been inconsistent. Her mother's medical bills had eaten the rest. Now she lived in a studio in Pilsen, with a radiator that clanged through the night like a prisoner testing his chains. And she survived on freelance drafting work and the particular dignity of a woman who refuses to let anyone see her cry in public. The bodega's door opened beside her, releasing a brief warmth scented with cardamom and frying oil. A man stepped out, umbrella first, and for one absurd moment, Ilara thought he might offer it to her. A small kindness from a stranger in a storm. But the man turned without seeing her and walked quickly north, and she was alone again. She tucked her phone into her pocket and watched the rain. She did not notice the black Escalade that had been idling across the street for the past 4 minutes. She did not notice the way the tinted window on the passenger side had lowered by exactly 2 inches, just enough for a pair of dark eyes to observe her through the curtain of rain, still and unblinking, as a man watching something he has not allowed himself to look at in a very long time. She did not notice that those eyes had catalogued every detail of her in the span of 30 seconds. The broken heel, the wet blazer, the way she lifted her chin against the cold as if daring the weather to do its worst. The small, involuntary smile that crossed her face when a child in a yellow raincoat went jumping through a puddle on the opposite sidewalk. She did not notice any of this because she had no way of knowing that Nico Valerio had been watching over her from a distance for the past 3 years. The Escalade window rose silently. "Follow until the car arrives," Nico said to the driver. His voice was flat, even, the voice of a man who had trained himself out of inflection the way other men trained themselves out of flinching. "Make sure she gets in safe. And then we go." He did not look away from the window until the yellow Uber headlights appeared at the corner, and Ilara Voss folded herself into the back seat, wet and tired and entirely unaware that the most dangerous man in the Midwest had just spent 4 minutes watching her in the rain as though she were the only thing in the world worth looking at. Ilara had known a boy named Nico once. She thought of him sometimes, the way you thought of a song you used to love before the radio played it to death, with a complicated tenderness, a sweetness edged with something she could not quite name. Longing, maybe, or the shadow of it, or something more honest than either. They had grown up 2 blocks apart in the Bridgeport neighborhood, back when Bridgeport was still the kind of place where your neighbors knew your name, and your business, and your mother's maiden name, and the precise day your father had stopped coming home. Nico's father had stopped coming home when Nico was 11. Ilara's had left when she was 9. That was the first thing they'd had in common. She had been 15 when she first really noticed him, tall for his age even then, with that particular stillness about him that she would later understand was not peace but control. dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he'd given up fighting it. Eyes so dark they absorbed light rather than reflected it, the color of coffee grounds, of turned earth, of something you could fall into without warning. He had been helping his mother carry groceries up the stairs of their building on a Sunday afternoon when Ilara, coming around the corner with her bicycle, had rear-wheeled directly into a pothole and gone sprawling across the sidewalk in the most spectacular and graceless fashion she had ever managed. Nico had set down the groceries, crouched beside her without a word, and examined the scrape on her palm with the careful seriousness of someone performing triage. "It's not deep," he'd said. "I know," she'd said, mortified. "You were going too fast around that corner." "I know." He'd looked up then, and she'd caught those dark eyes full on for the first time, and something had shifted in the architecture of her chest in a way that took her years to find language for. "I'm Nico," he'd said. "Ilara." "I know," he said. "You live on Halstead. Your mom works at St. James." She'd blinked. "How do you—" "I notice things." He stood, picked up the groceries again. "You should let that dry before you bandage it." And he had walked up the stairs without another word, leaving her sitting on the sidewalk with gravel in her palm and the peculiar, unfamiliar sensation of being seen. That had been the beginning. Now, in the back seat of the Uber, rain streaming down the windows, Ilara let her head fall back and closed her eyes, and she did not think about Nico Valerio. She had gotten very good at not thinking about him over the years. It was a discipline like any other. You noticed the thought approaching, you redirected, you found something else to do with your hands and your mind. She thought instead about the job interview tomorrow. The architectural firm on Michigan Avenue, mid-sized but growing, specializing in adaptive reuse projects. She had spent 3 evenings preparing. She knew their portfolio the way she knew her own handwriting. She could do this. She had rebuilt before. She would rebuild again. The Uber pulled up to her building. She paid through the app, tipped generously out of the $43 she couldn't afford, and ran through the rain to the front door. She did not see the second black Escalade parked at the end of her block. She did not see the man who stepped out of it briefly, confirmed that her lights came on in the third-floor window, and got back in. Nico Valerio sat in the back of his car and let the silence do what it was supposed to do, contain him. He was 31 years old. He had 3 legitimate businesses, 11 shell corporations, a penthouse on the 52nd floor of a building his company owned, and control of the most sophisticated criminal distribution network between Detroit and Kansas City. He had 2 scars on his left forearm, one on his jaw and one along his right rib cage that sometimes ached in cold weather. He had men who would die for him. He had enemies who tried regularly and unsuccessfully to arrange that outcome for him. He had not been back to Bridgeport in 9 years. He had not spoken to Ilara Voss in 9 years. He had, however, known exactly where she was for most of those 9 years, her address updated in his private files each time she moved, her circumstances monitored through a system so quiet and careful she would never detect it. He told himself this was protection. He told himself it was obligation. He told himself many things in the small hours of the night when the penthouse was quiet and the city sprawled below him like a kingdom he had bought at a price he still hadn't finished paying. None of the things he told himself were entirely true. "Mr. Valerio." Marco, his head of security, turned from the passenger seat. "The Dominelli situation." "Tomorrow," Nico said. "They're expecting your response tonight." "Then they'll be disappointed." He turned to look out the window at Ilara's building, at the lit rectangle of her window 3 floors up. "Tell them tomorrow. Tell them I'm unavailable." Marco turned back without comment. He had been with Nico for 6 years, and he had learned, as everyone who stayed close to Nico eventually learned, that there were subjects which were not discussed and silences which were not broken. The woman on the 3rd floor was both. Nico pressed 2 fingers to his mouth and thought about a girl who had once let him hold her hand on the L platform while they waited for the red line at midnight, her head barely reaching his shoulder, her voice low and warm against the city noise as she told him she wanted to be an architect someday, that she wanted to build things that lasted. Build things that last, he thought, looking up at her window. He had done that. He just hadn't been able to tell her what he'd built them from. The Valerio penthouse occupied the entire 52nd floor of the Meridian Tower, a 40-story glass needle on the northern edge of the loop that Nico's holding company had acquired 4 years ago as a legitimate investment and slowly, methodically transformed into the nerve center of everything he owned. The public spaces, the lobby, the event floors, the restaurant on the 22nd floor called Nero, were precisely what they appeared to be: beautiful, profitable, and tasteful. Nero had earned its 3rd Michelin star last year. The lobby had been featured in Architectural Digest. Nico had noted the irony of that without comment. The penthouse itself was not open to Architectural Digest. It was a study in deliberate restraint. High ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture selected for function as much as form. Dark walnut and brushed steel. Books more than people expected. Shelves that covered an entire wall, from floor to 12-foot ceiling. Paperbacks and hardbacks mixed without organization, the evidence of a man who read everything and organized nothing. A kitchen that was used. A bar that was well-stocked but not ostentatious. At 6:15 in the morning, Nico stood at the kitchen counter in a gray t-shirt and dark pants, drinking espresso and reading a report that had come through on his encrypted tablet at 4 a.m. The report was from his intelligence analyst, a woman named Petra, who had previously worked for the NSA before Nico had recruited her with a salary that made her government pension look like a joke. The report was about Alara. Not surveillance in any prurient sense. Nothing invasive, nothing she would recognize as oversight. Just a regular briefing, 3 pages, on the broad strokes of her current situation. Employment status, financial picture, known associates, any red flags that might indicate she'd come to someone's attention who shouldn't have that attention. The employment section was the part that made Nico set down his espresso. She'd had 3 temp positions in the past 8 months. She was interviewing today, 9 a.m., at Hargrove and Lim Architects on Michigan Avenue, a firm Nico knew by reputation and by balance sheet, having looked at acquiring the building they occupied last year before deciding against it. The firm was legitimate. The interview, according to Petra's summary, was for a junior associate position, a role that should have been a senior role given Alara's qualifications. The downgrade was the recession's doing and the markets, and neither fact softened the data. Her mother, Anna Voss, remained at the Skokie facility for assisted living. Monthly cost, $4,600. Alara's current income, insufficient by approximately $1,800 per month. Nico read the number twice. Set the tablet on the counter face down. He walked to the window and looked at the city waking up below him. The early commuters, the delivery trucks, the joggers on the lakefront path. The sky was the particular pale gray of early Chicago mornings, the lake a darker pewter in the distance. He had money. He had, by any rational measure, obscene amounts of money. He could eliminate Alara Voss's financial problems the way he eliminated other problems, with the application of resources and will. He could pay her mother's facility anonymously, arrange for the invoices to show a grant or a subsidy, construct a fiction so clean she would never find the seam. He had been doing variations of that for 3 years. The grocery delivery service she'd switched to because it was inexplicably 10% cheaper than anything comparable in her neighborhood. That was him, or rather a subsidiary, 3 companies removed from anything with his name on it. The parking ticket she'd contested last year and somehow won despite a frankly airtight case against her, also him, via a word to a city clerk who owed him a favor. The apartment in Pilsen with the inexplicably reasonable rent in an increasingly expensive neighborhood. The building's management company was controlled by a holding firm that Nico owned 60% of. He told himself these were small things. Maintenance, the minimum. He did not permit himself to examine, too carefully, what it said about him that he had spent 3 years constructing an invisible net beneath the life of a woman who did not know he was alive. What he knew was this: she was struggling. She was fighting. She was keeping her head up in the rain with her broken heel and her $43 checking account, and the world was going to take a very specific piece of her if he let it. He was not going to let it. The only question was how much longer he could manage that from a distance. 9 years ago, Nico Valerio had been 22 years old, $240 to his name, and very much in love with a girl he knew he had no right to touch. He had grown up understanding that the Bridgeport neighborhood had 2 economies, the one you could see and the one that moved beneath it like groundwater, invisible and essential and capable of undermining everything built on top of it. His father's absence had not been a disappearance. His father had been absorbed into the second economy and had chosen not to come back from it, which was a different kind of leaving. Nico had spent his teenage years walking the edge of that second economy, doing small things, fence work, carrying packages, learning the geography of favors and debts that constituted the real social structure of the neighborhood. He had been smart enough to see what he was learning. He had been smart enough to be afraid of it. Then Elara. Elara, who wanted to build things that lasted. Who talked about light and space and the way a building could be designed to make people feel something, safe or inspired, or simply more human than the street outside had left them. Who had the most precise memory of anyone he'd ever met. Who could tell you the exact pitch of the L train's whistle on Tuesday evenings versus Thursday mornings, as if the city were a score she was learning by heart. He had loved her so carefully, so deliberately, the way he did everything. No excess, nothing that couldn't be contained or retracted. He had held himself at a careful distance from the worst of what the neighborhood offered, for her, because she was the kind of person who deserved a life built in clean light. And he knew, even at 19, 20, 21, that he was not the kind of man who could give her that. He had been wrong about that in the end, not about the light, but about what it would take to get there. When he was 22, a man named Raymond Caruso had come to him with an offer that was not entirely an offer. Caruso ran the South Side's import operation, pharmaceuticals primarily, with side arrangements in document forgery and labor. He had been watching Nico for 2 years, and his offer was this: come work for me at a real level, or the small things you've been doing on the edges become known to people who will not be as patient as I am. Nico had sat across from Caruso in the back of a restaurant on South Halsted and understood, with the cold clarity that was the particular gift and burden of his intelligence, that there was no version of this negotiation in which he walked away clean. The only question was which direction Dirty went. He had gone home that night and sat at the foot of Alara's bed. She was asleep. He'd come in through the window they'd left unlatched for each other since they were 16, and he had watched her breathe in the dark for a long time. She had paint on her fingers. She was taking a studio art elective that semester alongside her architecture classes, and she came home with paint under her fingernails like colored ink, like the city was writing itself on her skin. She had been drawing a building she'd imagined, she'd told him 2 nights ago, a community center for the neighborhood, all glass and reclaimed brick, with a rooftop garden. He had sat at the foot of her bed and made the calculation. If he stayed, if he refused Caruso, the best case was Caruso making good on his threat, and Alara's proximity to Nico would make her proximity to all of it unavoidable. Her mother's building, the connections between their families, the web of neighborhood relationships that made the second economy possible. She would be tainted by association. More likely, she would be used as leverage. If he went all the way in, if he took Caruso's offer and then, in time, took Caruso's position and then the one above that, he could build something. Not clean, never clean, but powerful enough that he could draw a line around her and make it mean something. The third option was the simplest and the cruelest. Leave. Not go into Caruso's organization and stay nearby. Leave. Her, the neighborhood, the city, and everything that connected them. He had chosen the third option. He had left a note. 4 sentences. I'm sorry. I have to go. Don't look for me. You deserve better than what I am. He had not signed it. She would know his handwriting. He had not touched her face before he left, though his hand had hovered near her hair in the dark for a long moment. He had walked out. And then he had gone directly to Raymond Caruso and said yes. By 31, Nico Valerio was Raymond Caruso's successor, employer, and, in the only way that counted in their world, conqueror. He had spent 9 years building an empire with a level of intelligence and ruthlessness that had surprised even the people who considered themselves experts in ruthlessness. He was not cruel. He was precise. He did not punish capriciously. He did not expose civilians to the violence that lived at the margins of everything he controlled. He had rules, and the rules were simple, and the consequences for breaking them were not. He was feared because he was consistent, because when Nico Valerio said something would happen, it happened, because he had, on 3 separate occasions, dismantled the operations of men who had moved against him with a completeness that left his remaining adversaries very thoughtful about the costs of engagement. He was also, under the surface of all this, tired. He had built the empire. He had built it for a specific purpose. He had built it as a kind of fortress, and now that it was built, he lived inside it alone, and the woman it was meant to protect didn't know it existed, and he was not sure, in the cold mornings before his mind was fully armored, whether any of it had been worth it. He finished his espresso. He picked up his phone and called Petra. "The Hargrove and Lim position," he said when she answered. A pause. "Yes?" "I want to know the outcome. Today, as soon as you have it." Another pause. Longer. Petra was smart enough to ask no questions. "Of course." He hung up and went to get dressed for a day that had nothing to do with Alara Voss, which was most days, and which he got through the same way he got through everything, by making the next necessary move and not looking at the full board until he had to. The interview did not go badly. This was the worst possible outcome, Alara reflected afterward, sitting in a cafe on Michigan Avenue with her second coffee and an untouched croissant. If it had gone badly, she would know. She could recalibrate, identify what needed work, practice answers in the mirror. But it had gone not badly, which meant it had gone into the purgatorial middle space where she had no information and no control, where all she could do was wait for an email that would arrive in its own time and mean what it meant. She had liked the partners. Thomas Hargrove was 60 and wore his expertise lightly, asking precise questions that told her he'd actually read her portfolio rather than skimmed it. His partner, Jenna Lim, was 40 and sharp-eyed in a way Alara found immediately comfortable, the kind of sharp that was interested in your answers rather than trying to catch you out. She had answered well, she thought. She'd talked about her time at the previous firm, about the projects she'd contributed to before the layoff, careful not to frame it as victimhood, as grievance, as anything other than, here is what I learned and here is what I can do. She had not mentioned Daniel. She had not mentioned the $43, now reduced to $28 after the 2 coffees. They had said they'd be in touch by end of week. She sipped her coffee and looked out the window at Michigan Avenue in October. The trees along the boulevard gone to gold and copper, the magnificent mile already beginning its slow seasonal transformation toward holiday excess, lights appearing on storefronts that had been bare yesterday. Chicago in October was both beautiful and melancholy. The last warmth threading through the cold approach of winter like a hand you knew would be withdrawn. She pulled out her phone and checked her email. Nothing. Checked her bank balance out of what felt like compulsive self-punishment. Still 28. Her phone rang. Her mother's facility, the name appearing on screen, made something tighten in her chest, the specific anxiety of a daughter who was doing her best and was afraid her best might not be enough. "Ms. Voss?" The administrator's voice was careful, professional, and contained the shape of news she didn't want to hear. "We wanted to let you know that the payment for November processed successfully this morning." Alara frowned. I haven't submitted the November payment yet. I was planning to. It came through via wire transfer early this morning. We assumed you'd arranged it directly." "I didn't. There must be—" She paused. This had happened before. Twice in the past year, payments that she'd been certain hadn't processed had turned out to be already covered, with records showing a direct transfer from an account she didn't recognize. Both times she'd investigated and found nothing. The transfers had come from a holding company with no accessible information, and when she'd called the facility's billing department, they'd expressed confusion but accepted the payments. The first time, she'd been so relieved she hadn't pushed. The second time, she'd pushed harder and gotten nowhere. Now this. "I'll look into it," she said, keeping her voice even. "Thank you for letting me know." She sat with her phone in her lap for a moment after hanging up, looking at the gold and copper trees outside. Someone was paying her mother's bills. She had a very limited list of people with both the means and the motive. Her aunt in Portland, who was barely managing her own finances. A cousin in finance who had his own family to support and who had never offered. Friends from college, none of whom had this kind of money. She thought, not for the first time, about the untraceable quality of these interventions, the way they appeared at the exact moments of greatest pressure, the way they left no visible fingerprints. Someone precise, someone with resources, someone who knew enough about her specific situation to know when to act. She had never let herself follow that thought to its natural conclusion, because the natural conclusion was a dark-eyed boy from Bridgeport who had walked out of her life 9 years ago and left 4 sentences behind. And going down that road felt like a special kind of madness she couldn't afford. She stood, gathered her things, left a tip that made the $28 into $23, and went out into the October air. She had a drafting project due on Friday, a residential renovation in Lincoln Park for a client who was particular about details and moderately difficult to communicate with via email alone. She stopped at the library on the way home to use their printing station since her home printer was currently dying a slow, ink cartridge death, and spent an hour there cross-referencing code requirements for the project. The library in Pilsen was one of her favorite places in the city. It had been there since 1906, though rebuilt twice since, and it carried in its bones the particular quiet of a place that had survived many things and remained committed to being useful. She liked the reading room especially. High windows, oak tables, the smell of old paper and new carpet coexisting without apparent conflict. She was packing up her things when she noticed the man. He was sitting at a table near the reference section, mid-30s, compact build, the kind of nondescript that was almost a costume, a look achieved rather than natural. He was reading a magazine with the focused attention of someone who had chosen this particular activity because it required his eyes to be pointed somewhere. He had been there when she arrived. He was still there now. Ilara was a woman who had grown up in a neighborhood where certain instincts were useful, and the instinct prickling at the back of her neck right now said, "He's watching you." She put her laptop in her bag, smiled vaguely at no one in particular, and went to the bathroom near the back of the building, stood inside for 90 seconds, came back out via the route that took her past a different set of windows. The man was still at the table. He had not moved. She was projecting. She was a woman alone in a city, and the anxiety of the morning, the interview, the inexplicable payment, the $23, was making her paranoid. She left through the front door and took the long way home. She didn't see him follow her. She didn't see the brief exchange of texts between the man in the library and a contact saved in his phone simply as N. 3 words. She's heading home. She didn't see the response, which was also 3 words. Keep your distance. Thursday arrived with the email she had been training herself not to expect. Dear Ms. Voss, we are pleased to offer you the position of junior associate. She read it 3 times. She sat on the edge of her bed and held her phone with both hands and read it 3 times. And then she went to the window and looked at the street outside. A delivery truck double-parked, a woman walking a white terrier, the bodega across the way with its hand-lettered sign for mangoes 2 for $1, and let herself feel it. Not euphoria, something quieter and more durable than that. The particular satisfaction of a woman who has been grinding and has finally found purchase. She started on the 1st of November. Salary, $62,000, plus benefits. Not what she'd made before, but real. Enough. The beginning of something that could become enough. She called her mother who could not always follow the threads of a conversation anymore, but who could hear her daughter's voice and know that things were okay. And she kept her voice easy and bright and said, "I got the job, Mom." And her mother said, "I knew you would, sweetheart," with the confidence of a woman who had always believed this, even when the evidence ran against it. After she hung up, Ilara cried briefly, the good kind, the releasing kind. And then she washed her face and made a list of things she needed to do before her start date. She did not, on this particular Thursday, notice that a job she had been the 4th-ranked candidate for had become available to her, in part because the first 2 candidates had independently withdrawn their applications, following conversations with their current employers that had suggested, gently, professionally, without coercion, that their futures at their existing firms were perhaps more promising than previously believed. The 3rd candidate had received a competing offer from a small firm in Milwaukee that was inexplicably superior to anything the Milwaukee market would normally have produced. These things had been arranged, quietly and from a great distance, by a man who had learned that power was most useful when it was invisible. She went out Friday night to celebrate, which meant dinner with her friend Cassie at a Thai place in Wicker Park that had excellent larb and a BYOB policy that made celebration affordable. Cassie was a nurse who worked nights at Rush, and therefore had a talent for finding joy in narrow windows, which was one of the things Alara loved best about her. They drank 2 bottles of cheap Prosecco over dinner and talked about everything: the new job, Cassie's recent and catastrophic date with a man who had spent the entire evening explaining cryptocurrency to her, the fall menu at the Thai place, the state of the city, the state of the world. At some point, after the second bottle, Cassie said, "So, no one on the horizon?" "No horizon," Alara said. "What about that guy from the architecture conference?" "Marcus? He called me sweetie twice, in a meeting." "Yeah, no." Cassie topped off her glass. "Okay, but are you open to it? In principle?" "In principle, I'm open to many things." Alara turned her chopsticks against her palm. "In practice, I'm starting a new job in less than 2 weeks, and I'm still trying to get my financial situation under control, and I don't have the bandwidth to invest in someone else's feelings right now. Or your own feelings. Or my own feelings." Cassie looked at her with the specific look of someone who had been friends with her long enough to know when a subject was being deflected around. "Is this still about the Cassie? I'm not saying his name. Good. I'm just saying that 9 years is a long time to not be over something." "I'm over it," Alara said, and her voice was entirely even, and she raised her glass and smiled, and the smile was real enough, mostly, and Cassie let it go, because that was also one of the things Alara loved best about her. They finished the bottle and split the check and walked out into the cool October night, and Alara went home and slept without dreaming. Her first week at Hargrove and Lim was dense and good. She liked the work, actual work, drafting and design and problem-solving with colleagues who took their craft seriously. She liked having a desk with her name on it, a badge that opened doors, a reason to wear the blazer she'd repaired and dry-cleaned. She liked the way Jenna Lim ran the morning briefings, fast, focused, no wasted motion. She liked, unexpectedly, the project they assigned her on her 3rd day. It was a renovation project for a nightclub in the West Loop, a high-end venue called Nero, which had been expanding its lower level into an additional event space. The owner wanted the design to reflect the existing aesthetic of the club: dark, sophisticated, theatrical without being gauche. She'd done some preliminary research before the first client meeting, which was not scheduled until her 2nd week, but Alara believed in arriving at things already oriented, and pulled up everything she could find on Nero. The Michelin stars, the press coverage, the photos. It was, by any measure, beautiful. Someone with real taste and significant resources had built it, and the architecture of the space bore the marks of someone who thought seriously about how environments shaped experience. She'd looked up the ownership briefly, found a name attached to the parent company, Meridian Holdings, and a corporate address, but nothing more specific. The building itself, the Meridian Tower, was documented extensively. The owner, rather less so. She hadn't dug deeper. She was there to do a job, not to investigate a client. The client meeting was scheduled for Monday, November 9th at the venue itself at 7 p.m., after closing to the public, per the scheduling note. She added it to her calendar and went back to her drafting. The West Loop on a Monday evening in November had a particular quality. The restaurant rush winding down, the streets quieter than weekend nights, the storefronts casting warm rectangles of light onto wet pavement. Alara walked from the Green Line stop with her portfolio case over one shoulder and her laptop bag over the other, Thomas Hargrove beside her making small talk about the project parameters. Nero occupied the ground and basement floors of a building on West Randolph, its exterior deliberately understated, a black facade with minimal signage, the name picked out in fine, brushed gold letters above a door flanked by 2 men in dark suits who stood with the relaxed alertness of people for whom vigilance was a professional requirement. One of them opened the door as they approached, which meant they'd been expected, which meant someone inside had seen them coming. The interior, even after closing, was extraordinary. She had seen the photos online, but they hadn't prepared her for the experience of the space. The ceiling, 22 feet above the main floor, hung with hundreds of thin filaments of light that created the impression of standing under a dark sky full of close stars. The bar ran along the east wall in a curve of black marble and low amber light. Booths along the perimeter were upholstered in dark emerald velvet. The space had been designed so that the eye was constantly drawn inward, toward the central dance floor, while simultaneously feeling enclosed, private, and intimacy achieved at a scale that should have made intimacy impossible. "Remarkable," Thomas murmured beside her. Ilara was already taking notes. A man was crossing the floor toward them, mid-40s, Italian-looking, with the easy authority of a person who managed things for someone else and was very good at it. He introduced himself as Marco, the venue's director of operations, and said the principal would be joining them shortly, and led them to a booth near the back where a table had been set with mineral water and small plates of food. They were looking at the design documents Marco had laid out when Ilara heard the door. Not the front door, a side door, toward the back. The sound of it was the sound of a space changing, a particular stillness that preceded the entrance of someone to whom stillness deferred. She had felt that before, had experienced it as a child whenever her school principal walked into a room, or later when certain partners at her first firm arrived late to meetings. The room reorganizing itself around a gravitational point. She looked up. Nico Valerio walked across the floor of his nightclub the way he moved through everything, with an unhurried precision that was, in its own way, more commanding than speed. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, the jacket well cut over shoulders that had filled out considerably from the boy she remembered. His hair was darker, shorter. His jaw carried a scar she didn't remember. His eyes found her in the instant before her brain processed who he was. She felt the recognition hit her like cold water, a full-body cognitive disruption, the present moment briefly overwritten by the past. The L platform, his hand. I noticed things. The photograph accompanying his name, when she finally typed it into the search bar of her memory, confirmed it. Nico Valerio, Meridian Holdings. 9 years dropped away and collapsed back again in the span of 2 seconds. He stopped walking. The space between them was 20 feet and 9 years and everything that occupied that time. And it was also nothing at all, because the look on his face, gone the instant she registered it, was the look of a man who had not prepared for this moment, which was impossible, which was the most frightening thing about it, because he was clearly a man who prepared for everything. Then the moment sealed itself, and he continued walking. "Mr. Hargrove." His voice, deeper, stripped of everything that had ever been soft in it. He shook Thomas's hand, turned to Ilara. His eyes were the same. That was the part that undid her, just slightly, in the center of her chest. The same dark gravity, the same quality of seeing everything and deciding how much of what he saw to reveal. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I'm familiar with your work. I specifically requested you for this project." The sentence landed in her like a stone into still water. "Did you?" she said. Not a question. Not exactly. The flat tone of a woman who was assembling information in real time and needed a moment before she could decide what to do with it. "I did." He held her gaze for precisely the length of time it took to communicate that he was not uncomfortable, that he had no intention of being uncomfortable, that whatever history occupied the space between them was going to be managed on his terms. "Sit down. Let's talk about the project." She sat down. Her heart was hammering in a way she kept firmly below the surface, in the controlled space where she had spent 9 years learning to put things that needed to stay contained. Thomas was already talking, something about the square footage and the load-bearing considerations. And Nico was listening and nodding, and his eyes had moved away from her to the plans on the table. And Ilara opened her portfolio case and took out her preliminary sketches with hands that were entirely steady. "You deserve better than what I am. 4 sentences, 9 years. And here he sat across from her in a nightclub that bore the marks of extraordinary power and wealth, and he had requested her specifically, and she didn't yet know what that meant or what to do about it, but she was very certain of one thing. She was not going to let him see that it had touched her. Not tonight. Not yet. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Ilara worked with the focused professionalism of someone who has staked something on the quality of their performance, because she had. Her new reputation at a new firm, her sense of herself as someone who could conduct herself with dignity in the presence of a man who had broken something in her at 19 and left it to heal crooked. She asked precise questions. She took detailed notes. She offered 3 preliminary concepts for the expanded lower level: a sensory continuity approach that extended the existing aesthetic downward, a contrasting underground concept that played against the intimacy of the upper floor, and a hybrid that used threshold design to create a journey between the two spaces. She talked about materials, about acoustic considerations, about the way the existing light design could be referenced rather than replicated below. Nico listened to all of it without interrupting, which was both appropriate and unsettling, because his attention was the kind that made you feel the full weight of being heard. Thomas was clearly pleased. He asked the kind of following questions that meant he was already thinking about the project timeline, already trusting the direction. Nico, at the end of her presentation, looked at her steadily and said, "The hybrid approach. Develop that one." "I'd recommend presenting all 3 to you in more detail before the hybrid," he said again. "I know what I want." The sentence had a subtext she didn't reach for, because reaching for it would have been its own kind of capitulation. "All right," she said. They shook hands at the end, Thomas and Nico, and then Nico and Alara, and the moment his hand closed around hers, she felt the exact same thing she had felt on the sidewalk in Bridgeport when she was 15 years old, which was the infuriating continuity of the body's memory, its complete indifference to decisions the mind had made. His hand was warm and dry, and held hers for precisely 2 seconds. "Thank you for coming," he said. "It's my job," she said. Something moved in his eyes. Not quite a smile, something smaller and more complicated. And then he was turning, and Marco was escorting them toward the door, and the night had them again. Thomas, on the walk back to the L, talked about the project with the enthusiasm of a man whose firm had just landed something significant. The owner had a reputation, he said. Not specified, but the way he said it carried the careful inflection of a man who knew things he wasn't going to say to a junior associate. Paid well, very clear vision. Some complexity in his requirements around privacy and discretion. "Does he have a reputation as a difficult client?" Alara asked. "No, actually," Thomas considered. "More that his projects require a certain robustness. He doesn't work with people who can't handle ambiguity." "What kind of ambiguity?" Thomas looked at her with a mild curiosity. "You two seem to know each other." The night air was cold. Alara adjusted her portfolio case strap. "We grew up in the same neighborhood. We knew each other briefly, a long time ago." "Ah." Thomas nodded, and his expression suggested he was filing this and would not pursue it. "Well, he asked for you specifically, as he said. I'd say that's a good sign for where the project can go." "I'll have the concept development ready by end of next week," she said. "Perfect." She took the red line home and sat in the corner seat and looked at her own reflection in the dark window and thought, Nico Valerio. She thought about the scar on his jaw, which was not from a kitchen accident or a car door. She thought about the way the 2 men at the front door of Nero had clocked the room before Nico entered it. She thought about Marco, who moved with a fluency that suggested he was not simply a venue manager. She thought about Meridian Holdings and what it held, and she thought about the anonymous payments to her mother's facility, and she thought about the grocery delivery service with the inexplicably low prices, and she thought about the rent on her apartment that had never once been raised, despite the neighborhood's trajectory. She thought, how long? She thought, how much? She thought, why? And underneath all of it, beneath the questions and the anger that was beginning to solidify from the shock, there was something she absolutely refused to name. A warmth she pressed her thumb against like a bruise to confirm it was real. And then she stopped. She got off at her stop and walked home in the cold and did not let herself feel anything else until she was inside with the door locked. Then she sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and said, out loud, to the radiator and the cracked ceiling and the city outside, "What are you doing?" The radiator clanged, which was not an answer, but was at least honest. He called her 3 days later. Not her cell. He'd have had to get that from the firm. He called the firm's main line and asked to speak with her, and the receptionist put him through, and when she picked up and said Alara Voss in her professional voice, there was a pause on the other end that lasted just long enough to be intentional. We need to discuss the project timeline, Nico said. I'm available Thursday. I need to move faster than the standard workflow allows. I want to bring you on directly for the duration of this project, a consulting arrangement, separate from Hargrove and Lim's standard contract. She processed this carefully. That would need to go through Thomas. I've already spoken with Thomas. He's amenable, provided you agree. The rate would be, he quoted a number that was double what she currently made. The arrangement would last the duration of the project, 6 months, potentially 12. What does the arrangement entail exactly? Access. I'll need you available on shorter timescales than a standard client-consultant relationship usually requires. I may need you to be in the building during certain phases of the work, and I prefer to conduct project discussions directly rather than through the firm as intermediary. She heard all of this, and also heard what it didn't say. This is a significant departure from standard practice, she said. I don't do standard practice, he said. You know that. The directness of it, the acknowledgement, however oblique, that there was something to know, steadied her somehow. She had expected him to pretend there was no history. The pretense would have been worse. I'll think about it, she said. Until tomorrow, he said. Not a question, an expectation. And the infuriating thing, the genuinely maddening thing, was that she already knew she was going to say yes, because the project was extraordinary and the money was real, and because somewhere beneath all of her reasonable objections there was a question she had been carrying for 9 years that had the shape of, why did you leave? And the faint possibility of an answer. She would think about it tonight. She would say yes tomorrow. She said yes. She told herself it was the money, the project, the professional opportunity. She was mostly able to believe this in daylight, in the clean light of the firm's design studio, while she was working, while her hands were occupied and her mind had the comfortable structure of a problem to solve. The night before her first direct site meeting with Nico, now in the second week of November, she arranged her preliminary drawings on her kitchen table and tried to pretend her hands were not slightly less steady than usual. The arrangement was formal, signed contracts, a project scope, a timeline with deliverables. All of it processed through the firm's legal team, all of it above board in the ways that mattered professionally. The additional compensation was substantial. It was, on paper, exactly what it appeared to be. What it appeared to be and what it was were not entirely the same thing, and they both knew it. And the fact that they both knew it, and neither had said so directly, was the particular tension she was navigating. She arrived at Nero at 8 a.m. The building wasn't open to the public until 9 p.m., so the mornings were work hours for renovations. And Marco met her at the service entrance with a keycard. The basement level was being stripped to its bones. Contractors worked steadily through the space, which currently had the skeletal clarity of something mid-transformation. Bare concrete, exposed ducting, the honest bones of the building visible before the skin was applied. She loved buildings at this stage. They told the truth about themselves in a way they wouldn't once the finishes were in. She was deep in a measurement exercise, crouched at the base of a load-bearing column, when she heard Nico come in behind her. She did not look up immediately. She finished the measurement, wrote it down, then stood and turned. He was in a charcoal suit, white shirt, no tie again. She was beginning to think he simply didn't wear them, and she found herself wondering when he'd stopped, whether the tie had been a concession he'd made once and then abandoned. He had a coffee cup in one hand and was looking at her with that same quality of contained attention, like a man who was deciding how much of the conversation to conduct in words. You read the structural report? He said. Twice. She showed him her measurement. The original drawings show this column as non-load-bearing, but the report contradicts it. I want confirmation from a structural engineer before we commit to the opening. He nodded. I'll have Petra arrange it today. The name caught her slightly. Petra. Not, I'll have my assistant, or I'll contact the engineer. The casual specificity of someone whose organization was so present to him that he named its parts without thinking. Thank you, she said. There was a pause, the kind that accumulates content even in silence. You're good at this, he said. I know. She kept her voice even. You said you'd reviewed my work before requesting me. I had. Seeing it in practice is different. She looked at him directly. Nico? using his first name deliberately not calling him Mr. Valerio, because that would be a kind of distance she had decided not to grant him. "Are we going to talk about it?" His expression didn't change exactly. It clarified. Something behind it became more present, less contained. "At some point," he said. "When is some point?" "When you're ready." The presumptuousness of this, the quiet certainty that she was the variable in the equation, made her jaw tighten slightly. "I'm not a project timeline." "No," he agreed, and something moved through his voice that was not quite an apology and not quite an acknowledgement, but occupied the same register. "You're not." She turned back to her drawings. "The structural engineer. Can you have them here tomorrow morning?" "Before noon." "Good." She uncapped her pen. "Then we can proceed with the west section while we wait." She heard him take a step back, felt the room redistribute itself in the way it did when he was no longer at its center. "I'll be in my office until noon," he said. "Third floor, if you need anything." "I have Marco's number." A pause. "You have mine." She didn't answer. She was already bent over the drawing again, making notes with the careful precision of a woman who had more important things to do than acknowledge the particular quality of "you have mine" when said in that voice, at that hour, in a stripped-to-bones room. She did not, however, manage to stop herself from being aware, for the rest of the morning, that he was 3 floors above her. The penthouse. He brought her there 2 weeks later, not with any drama or formality, but because the client meeting he'd scheduled had run long, and it was dark and cold outside, and he said, simply, "Come up, I have the revised plans already there." She had a moment in the elevator, the private lift that required his key card, where she thought about whether to say no. The moment passed without action, which was itself a decision. The penthouse was not what she expected. She had built an expectation in her head, all the trappings of the powerful, all the deliberate excess of a man who wanted his wealth visible. What she found was something both simpler and stranger. The books, everywhere. The kitchen, with its evidence of actual use. The furniture arranged for habitation rather than display. The windows were extraordinary. 52 floors above the city, the entire panorama laid out like a blueprint she had once tried to memorize from street level, now fully legible. The grid of lights, the dark edge of the lake, the distant glow of suburbs, all of it contained in glass that was so clean it was almost not there. She stood at the window for a long moment without speaking. "How long have you been here?" she asked, not meaning just the penthouse. "In Chicago? 3 years, this time. Before that, I was primarily in New York. Before that," a pause, brief as a skip in a record. "Other places." "What places?" "Places I needed to be." She turned from the window. He was standing near the kitchen island, a glass of water in his hand, watching her in the way she was slowly learning to calibrate, the way that was always some percentage more than it appeared. "The plans," she said. He set the water down and crossed to the table, and they worked for 2 hours, side by side, over the revised drawings, and she noted things about him that she didn't mean to note. The way he pointed at a detail on a drawing with his pen rather than his finger, a habit of precision. The way he went still, completely still, when he was thinking. The scar on his left forearm, visible when his jacket was off, that had not been there when they were young, and that she absolutely did not let herself ask about. It was the most complicated 2 hours she'd spent in recent memory, being in a room with someone she was furious at and professionally impressed by, and, she admitted it only to herself, only in the most private corner of her interior, still affected by in the very specific way she had been at 15. She left at 10 p.m. He walked her to the elevator. "The structural report came back," he said. "Columns load-bearing. You were right." "I usually am," she said, and the elevator door opened and she stepped in. The last thing she saw before the door closed was his face, and the expression on it was one she hadn't seen on him before. Something unguarded, brief as a candle in wind. Almost, she thought, going down, like relief. She started to understand what he was, in increments. The second visit to Nero, the 4th overall, 2 weeks into December, a man arrived unannounced in the middle of their working session in the basement. He came through a door she hadn't known was a door, appearing at the end of the corridor with the particular entitlement of someone who expected to not be questioned, and behind him were 2 other men, and the temperature in the room changed. Not metaphorically. The temperature changed because Marco appeared at the same moment from the opposite end, and the contractors stopped working without being told, and Nico stepped away from the drawing table to the center of the room with the economy of motion she was beginning to recognize as his particular form of readiness, not threat exactly, but capability, immediately present. "Dominelli," Nico said. Nothing else. The man, 60s, silver hair, the build of someone who had been physically formidable once and had not entirely vacated it, smiled with the specific warmth of a man who was not warm. "Valerio, heard you were doing some renovations." "You heard right. Wanted to have a conversation. My schedule is full today. This won't take long." His eyes moved to Alara, a swift and comprehensive appraisal that took in everything and concluded something she didn't like. "Don't let me interrupt." "You are interrupting," Nico said, still in the same even tone. "Marco will see you out." Something passed across Dominelli's face. Not surprise, but the calculation of a man adjusting tactics. "Of course." He turned to go, then paused. "Who's the architect, Valerio? Nice to know the people working in your spaces." "She works for me," Nico said. "That's enough for you to know." The doors, two of them, simultaneously, and they were gone. Alara became aware that her pulse was elevated. She set her pen down deliberately. "Was that—" "Not relevant to the project," Nico said, returning to the drawings as though no interruption had occurred. His voice was entirely even, but she had learned, in 2 weeks of close proximity, that evenness in him was not absence of feeling. It was structure. A container built specifically to hold what would otherwise be visible. "It seemed relevant to my safety." He looked up at that. A direct look, the kind she still hadn't gotten entirely used to. "Nothing in this building will touch you." "That sounds like a guarantee you made to yourself rather than a guarantee you made to me." Something moved in his jaw. "You're right," he said. "Both." "Tell me who that was." A pause. "Marcus Dominelli. He runs a competing organization with interests in the West Loop. We've had disputes. The kind of disputes that follow people through private doors." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is this going to happen again?" "Not here. I'll have it addressed." She wanted to ask what addressed meant, in his vocabulary, in his world. She had enough understanding of what he was. She'd done her research, quietly, in the way that a careful woman who was raised in a certain neighborhood and had a certain kind of intelligence eventually did, to know that addressed covered a range of outcomes. She was not naive. She had not been naive since she was old enough to understand the second economy of Bridgeport and what it produced. What she felt, sitting with this information, was not fear. Not exactly. It was the more complicated response of someone who had spent years constructing a version of a person from a memory, and was now confronting the reality that the person had become something more complex and darker than the memory, and who was not entirely certain that the complexity and darkness changed everything she thought it changed. She turned back to the drawings. "The East Corridor," she said. "I want to revisit the threshold treatment." He sat back down across from her. "Show me." She did her research that evening. Nico Valerio, Meridian Holdings. The corporate layers were opaque in the way of things that were specifically designed to be opaque. Shell companies within holding firms within investment vehicles, the geography of legal obscurity. What was legible was the legitimate business. The tower, the restaurant, a portfolio of real estate that was not inconsiderable, some technology investments. Clean on the surface. Below the surface, and here she had to leave the clean digital records and go to other sources, to the kind of journalism that published at the edges of mainstream interest, to accounts that circulated in the specific communities that tracked these things. The picture was different. Not documented with the precision of legal evidence, more like accumulated shadow, the suggestion of Valerio's name in connection with distribution networks, with certain labor agreements, with the specific kind of dispute resolution that didn't go through courts. He was, in the language she'd grown up understanding without ever being told explicitly, connected. More than connected, the connection. She sat with this for a long time. She thought about the boy who had read to her from library books on L platforms and argued with her about the Burnham Plan, with the passion of someone who cared deeply about cities and what they were for. She thought about the note. "You deserve better than what I am." He had known what he was becoming. He had told her in 4 sentences, and she had spent 9 years thinking he'd meant it as rejection, as judgment of himself relative to her, as the classic male sacrifice narrative, when perhaps what he had meant was something more literal. I am becoming something dangerous. I am removing myself from your proximity because proximity to me will put you in danger. She was not naive enough to find this romantic, exactly. She was, however, beginning to suspect that it was true. December in the penthouse, late on a Thursday, and the Lara had been there long enough that she had stopped treating the space as unfamiliar. This happened by increment. The first time she'd accepted coffee there, when the morning meeting had run past 11 and Marco had appeared with a French press without being asked. The second time, when she'd been working on the drawings late and Nico had, without ceremony, ordered dinner from Nero's kitchen and had it brought up, and they'd eaten at the work table over the blueprints, with the particular ease of 2 people who had been somewhere before together and hadn't entirely left. Now she sat cross-legged on the floor near the bookshelves, not working, for once, just looking at the spines, while Nico made tea in the kitchen. "You have all of these?" she called over her shoulder. "Most of them." "You've read all of them?" "Most of them." She pulled one out, a battered paperback of The Count of Monte Cristo. The spine was creased from multiple readings. She turned it in her hands. "This one especially," she said. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with 2 mugs, and his expression at the sight of the book was the expression she'd been waiting for. Not the composed surface, but something that lived underneath it, something she recognized, and that frightened her somewhat with what it meant about how much of him she was starting to be able to read. "Yes," he said, "that one especially." She set it back on the shelf. A man who builds a new identity out of necessity and uses it to navigate a world he never asked to inhabit. Among other things. What other things? He brought her the tea and sat on the floor across from her, his back against the opposite shelf, which was a distinctly unguarded posture for a man who was generally so architecturally composed. She noticed. She noticed everything now. "The part about love being the one variable he couldn't account for in any of his plans," he said. The sentence went into the room and stayed there. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "Nico. Ilara. We're going to have the conversation." "I know. Not tonight." She looked at him levelly. "Not because I'm not ready. Because I want to finish the 2nd floor threshold design first. And once we have that conversation, I'm not sure I'll be able to work with you the same way. And the project comes first." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's practical. I'm a practical person. You used to cry at the lake in September, every year." The specificity of it, the knowledge that he knew this about her, that he had known her closely enough and long enough to know the particular rhythm of her grief, hit her in the chest in a way she took a moment to absorb. "I was grieving my father," she said. "That was different. That was allowed." "All of it is allowed," he said. "Not the part where I sit on the floor of a dangerous man's penthouse and feel things I should have resolved 9 years ago." "Dangerous man," he said, and his tone was something she couldn't entirely read. Not amusement, not offense, something in between, something almost like self-recognition. "That's fair." "Is it accurate?" "Yes." The word came without hesitation, without deflection, without the kind of charm most men deployed at a moment like this to soften the edges of what they were. He said it clean and direct, and the honesty of it was almost worse than an evasion would have been, because honesty couldn't be dismissed. "Then we'll have the conversation when the threshold designs are done," she said. "And you'll tell me the truth." "I'll tell you the truth," he said. "I've been planning on it for a long time." She called Cassie that night and did not say everything, but said enough. "You're working for a... you know," she said, from her kitchen floor, which was beginning to be her floor for difficult conversations with herself and others. "I know," Cassie said. "I looked him up when you mentioned the project. You didn't say anything. I was waiting for you to get there." Ilara turned her teacup in her hands. "He's the same. Underneath all of it. The surface is completely different, but something underneath is the same." "Is that comforting or terrifying?" "Both," Ilara said. "Yeah," Cassie said. "That's pretty much what I figured." "What would you do?" Cassie was quiet for a moment. "I think I'd want to know the truth before I made any decisions. And I think I'd make sure the decisions were mine, not his." A pause. He has a way of arranging things. The anonymous payments, the apartment, the grocery thing. Alara, he's been managing your life. I know. That's either deeply romantic or deeply concerning, and I've been going back and forth on which. Me too, Alara said. Me too. The threat arrived, as threats in Nico's world typically did, sideways. Alara was in the basement with two contractors working on the threshold design install, the East Corridor's entrance sequence, which she'd revised 3 times and was finally satisfied with, when her phone showed a text from an unknown number. Careful who you keep close. Some protections have sharp edges. She stood looking at it for a moment, conscious of a coldness that was not the basement air and not the November chill from the service entrance. She typed back, "Who is this?" No response. She photographed the text, put her phone in her pocket, continued directing the contractors, and waited until she was alone in the elevator going up to Nico's office before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it. His door was open. He was on the phone, a call in Italian, quick and clipped, the kind of conversation that was conducted in code, even within a language most of the room didn't speak. He saw her face when she came in, said 3 words into the phone, and hung up. She showed in the text. He read it without touching the phone, which told her he knew enough to be careful about what he touched. He read it once, and his face did something she had never seen it do. Went from composed to cold in a way that was different from his usual controlled surface. This was not containment. This was a temperature drop. "When did this arrive?" he said. 20 minutes ago. "From the same number as anything else you've received?" "Unknown number. I've never gotten anything from unknown numbers." He pulled out his own phone, typed something, and within 30 seconds, Marco was in the doorway. "The number," Nico said, and read it to him. Marco was gone. Nico set her phone on the desk between them and looked at her with an expression that was doing something she hadn't seen before, calculating the distance between what he wanted to say and what was necessary to say, and choosing the necessary. "This is Dominelli," he said. "It's a communication to me, not to you." "He used my phone number to communicate with you." "Yes. To tell you that being close to you has consequences. For me." "Yes." She took her phone back. She sat in the chair across his desk, not invited, simply sat, because her legs had briefly suggested that standing was more effort than was warranted. "How does Dominelli know my phone number?" "He's been watching you since the day he saw you in the basement." "And you know this how?" "I have people watching him." She breathed. The radiator in this room, unlike the one in her apartment, was entirely silent. "How long has he been a problem?" 2 years, actively. Longer as a background situation. Will he act on this? Nico looked at her with the directness that was his particular form of respect. Not protective lying, not managed information, but the truth as it existed, undecorated. "Not while I can help it." "While you can help it," she repeated. "That's not as reassuring as you may have intended." "I don't intend reassurance." He leaned forward slightly. "What I intend is to give you accurate information so that you can make decisions from a position of knowledge rather than managed ignorance." This specifically, was the thing that she was most unable to dismiss about him. The respect embedded in it, the refusal to treat her as something to be protected by keeping her in the dark. "Okay," she said, "accurate information. How serious is this?" "Serious enough that I'm moving you." "Moving me where?" "Your apartment in Pilsen is not secure enough for the current situation." She stared at him. "You are not moving me out of my apartment." "I'm not. I'm arranging alternate accommodation that has appropriate security infrastructure. It will be in your name, paid for by the project arrangement." "Nico," she held up a hand. "Stop." He stopped. "You cannot manage my living situation," she said, with the careful evenness of someone who was very angry and was choosing precision over volume. "You cannot relocate me like a chess piece because a problem you created is now adjacent to my life." "A problem I created." He said it quietly, without defense. "Isn't it?" "Yes," he said. "It is." "Then you deal with the problem. You don't relocate me. I'm not a variable in your contingency planning." He looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in his face. Not capitulation exactly, but the closest thing to it she'd seen. The recognition that this argument, on the terms on which she was making it, was one he had no ground to contest. "There will be additional security on your building," he said. "Discreet. You won't see them." "I won't see them because they won't be there, or I won't see them because you're good at invisible?" "The second one." "I know," she said, and stood, and the weight in those two words, the accumulated knowing of weeks of proximity, of payments and invisible arrangements, and a neighborhood boy who had become something enormous and secret, sat between them like a third person in the room. She left. He let her. He did not move from behind the desk until he heard the elevator. Then he picked up his phone and made 3 calls, and by the end of the 3rd call, the Dominelli situation had moved from managed to active, and Marcus Dominelli would receive, by morning, a very clear communication about the costs of involving civilians. He did not use violence for this. He used something more expensive: information. The particular information, financial, personal, professional, that Dominelli had invested considerable effort in keeping private. The message was received. She finished the threshold design on a Friday in mid-December. The East Corridor entrance sequence was everything she'd intended it to be, a controlled darkening of light as you descended from the main floor to the lower level, the walls shifting from the warm amber of the club above to a cooler, more atmospheric blue-gray below, the transition happening so gradually that you were at the bottom before you realized you'd left the top. The threshold itself, a wide arch in raw steel and dark-stained timber, was both structural and ceremonial, the moment of passage made legible in the architecture. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked back up through the arch and felt the thing she always felt when a design resolved correctly: the clean, quiet satisfaction of a problem solved in the right language. "It's exactly right," Miko said from behind her. She turned. He was standing at the base of the stairs. She hadn't heard him come down, which was not as surprising as it should have been, given how quietly he moved through spaces. He was looking up through the arch, and his expression was unguarded in the way it occasionally became when he was responding to something rather than managing it. "You wanted it to feel like descent without danger," she said. "That's hard. Usually descent in design implies one or the other, subterranean oppressiveness or false brightness. This is neither." "Neither," he agreed, still looking at the arch. "It feels like going somewhere." "That's the idea." He looked at her. "We said when the design was done." She nodded. "Come on, then." They went to the penthouse, not to the work table this time, to the living area, which she had occupied before in working proximity, but never in the mode of two people about to be honest with each other. She sat on the couch. He sat on the opposite side, which meant there was space between them, enough that the conversation could happen in its own air, without the confusion of proximity. He talked for a long time. She had expected, perhaps, that the history would come out in fragments, conditionally, with the careful calibration of a man who had spent years managing information. What she got was different, a straight line through the story, from the beginning. The Caruso meeting, his father's debts, which had left Nico with a secondary inheritance, obligations that the second economy of Bridgeport had been very patient about until Nico was old enough to settle them. The understanding, at 22, that there was no clean exit from those obligations, only the choice of which direction dirty went. The night at her bedside, which he described in the kind of specific detail that could only mean it had been recalled many times. Her paint-stained fingers, the drawing she'd left on her desk of the imagined community center, the way the streetlight came through the gap in the curtain and made a line across the floor. The note, what it cost to write it, what he had done after. Caruso, then the years of consolidation, of learning the geography of the second economy, and eventually becoming its cartographer, its architect. The rules he'd made for himself, the things he would not do, the lines he would not cross, and the things he had done, stated without euphemism. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he stopped, she said, "The payments. To my mother's facility." "Yes." "The apartment." "Yes." "The grocery service. The parking ticket." "Yes." "How long?" 3 years of direct involvement. Before that," he paused, "I kept track of you. I had information. I didn't intervene." What changed 3 years ago? Something moved across his face that was, she now recognized, the outermost visible edge of something much larger beneath. Your mother's first hospitalization. The facility she needed. It was more than you could manage. I watched you try to manage it. And you couldn't watch anymore. No. She sat with this. The room was very quiet. 52 floors below, Chicago went about its business. You made yourself into this, she said carefully, because you believed it was the only way to be powerful enough to protect me. Among other people, but yes, you were... He stopped, started again. You were the first reason. You were the clearest reason. I didn't ask to be protected. I know. I didn't ask you to destroy yourself for my sake. I didn't destroy myself. His voice remained even, but there was something underneath it, not quite pain, something more resolved than pain, something that had been through pain and come out the other side into a kind of acceptance that was its own form of grief. I made choices. Some of them were wrong. Some of them were the only choices available. I'm not asking you to absolve me. What are you asking? He looked at her directly. The dark eyes, the scar on his jaw, the whole complicated architecture of what 9 years had made him, all of it present, none of it hidden. Nothing, he said. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you the truth because you asked for it. What you do with it is yours. She stood. She walked to the window because she needed the breath of the city to absorb what she was feeling, which was not one thing, was not the clean, manageable emotion of a simple situation, was instead the full, inconvenient complexity of a person who had loved someone young, who had spent years cultivating the careful scar tissue of that grief, and who was now being told that the grief had been, in some important sense, unnecessary, had been, from one angle, an act of love so extreme and so misguided that it was almost monstrous, and, from another angle, the most coherent thing a 22-year-old boy with no other options had been able to do. I'm furious, she said, to the window, to the city. I know. Not at the leaving, at the not telling me. She turned. You should have told me. You should have found a way. You would have tried to help me. Yes. You would have come into it with me. Yes. Then you understand why I couldn't tell you. She looked at him for a long time. That's not the same as forgiving you for it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. But something in his voice said something different. Not contradicting the words, but running beneath them like groundwater. The truth his pride wouldn't frame as a request. She turned back to the window. I need time, she said. Take it, he said. She went home. She took the private elevator down. He didn't follow her, which was either respect or restraint or both, and walked out into the December night and stood on the sidewalk outside the Meridian Tower for a moment, letting the cold organize her. She walked. Not anywhere in particular. She walked the way she processed, the way she always had, through the physical act of moving through the city she loved, taking it in through feet and eyes and the cold air in her lungs. Down through the loop, along the river for a stretch, the water black and still tonight, the lights of the bridges reflected in it like the ghost of day. North along Michigan, past the stone lions of the Art Institute with their crowns of Christmas lights. Into the park, briefly, the trees stripped bare and skeletal against the night sky. She thought about a boy who had read to her on L platforms. She thought about a man who had watched her in the rain from a tinted window and made sure her Uber arrived safe. She thought, I became the devil just so I could build a sanctuary for my angel. He hadn't said those words, but that was the shape of what he'd said. She thought about whether you could love someone and also be very angry at them, and concluded, from experience, that this was, in fact, the only way love ever fully existed, as a thing large enough to contain both. She thought about her mother, in a clean facility with competent care and a room with a window, and the fact that this was real, and was there because someone had decided to make it be there. She thought about the architecture of the lower level at Nero, the threshold she'd designed, the descent that felt like going somewhere rather than going under. She walked home. She did not call Nico. She slept, and in the morning she felt not resolution. She was too honest for the word resolution, which implied a cleaning up that hadn't happened, but rather clarity, a map of the terrain she was in, however complicated. She went to the firm. She worked. She was good at her job, and she let herself be good at it. He didn't call for 3 days, which was itself a form of communication. When she finally texted him, "I have some details to review before the lower-level contractors start on Monday," his response came within 2 minutes. "When works for you?" She answered, "Saturday morning." He answered, "I'll be there." Saturday morning, the building quiet, just the two of them in the lower level with the threshold arch standing clean and complete above them. She showed him the contractor notes. She went through the specifications for the final phase of the installation. She was professional and prepared, and she maintained the appropriate working distance. Halfway through, she set down her pen. "I'm not forgiving you," she said. "Not yet. I want to be clear about that." He met her eyes. Understood. "And I'm not... What's happening here, whatever it is, isn't happening because I owe you something. Not for the payments, not for any of it. I know you don't think of it that way, but I want it said." "You don't owe me anything," he said, with an immediacy that told her he had thought about this too, had perhaps worried about it. "You've never owed me anything." "Good." She picked up her pen. "Then we're on the same ground." She looked at him, and something in her chest, which had been holding itself very carefully for the past several days, exhaled slightly. Not surrender, not resolution, but the first movement of something that had been still. "Tell me something true," she said. "Not about the past, about now." He was quiet for a moment. "Every morning," he said, "for 3 years, I've read Petra's briefing about your circumstances, and I've told myself it was just maintenance. Protection at a distance." A pause. "I haven't believed that for a long time." She held his gaze. "What do you believe it was?" "The nearest I could get," he said, "to something I didn't think I had the right to want." The lower level of Nero was quiet. The threshold arch stood above them, steel and timber, the things she had built to make descent feel like arrival. The 52 floors of his tower rose above that, carrying the weight of everything he had built and what it had cost. She looked at the arch. She looked at him. "Okay," she said. "Not, I forgive you. Not, I love you. Not any of the clean, simple sentences the moment might, in a simpler story, have demanded. Just, okay." The beginning of a willingness to be in the same room with the full truth of it, without flinching. His exhale was barely audible. "Okay," he said. Nero's annual December gala was not public, which was to say it was not on the public calendar, which was to say that the 600 people who attended it were there by invitation alone and were precisely the composition of Chicago's highest strata of influence, the places where legal and financial and, in some cases, other kinds of power intersected in the specific way they did in cities that had been built and maintained by the organized, the ambitious, and the ruthless. Alara was invited because she was the architect for the expansion, and because Nico asked her. He asked her with the same directness he applied to everything, which meant there was no pretense of professional obligation attached to the invitation. "Come to the gala," he said on Monday afternoon, 3 days after Saturday, "as my guest." She looked at him for a moment. "Your guest?" "Yes." "Not your architect?" "You can be both." She thought about saying no, and thought about what no would mean, whether it would mean the prudent maintenance of professional boundaries, or whether it would mean fear, and she had spent enough years with fear to recognize its shape and refuse to mistake it for wisdom. "I'll need to find a dress," she said. "That can be arranged." "I'll arrange it myself, thank you." He nodded, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did when something satisfied him, which she was increasingly able to read as approximately equivalent to a smile. The dress she found was the color of deep water, a silk dark teal, simply cut, the kind of dress that did not announce itself and did not need to. She spent more than she should have. She did not regret it. The gala was everything the space suggested it would be. The main floor of Nero, fully open, lit to the finest calibration of the filament ceiling, the bar impeccable, the kitchen's canapes extraordinary. The guest list was, as she had expected, a particular kind of beautiful and dangerous. Beautiful in the surfaces they presented to each other, dangerous in the currents that moved beneath. She arrived to find Nico already at the center of the room, not physically, but gravitationally. People moved around him in the specific pattern of people orbiting a fixed point. He was in black, which should not have been remarkable, but was, in the precise cut of the suit, in the way he wore it like a decision rather than a choice. He saw her the moment she came in. She knew this because he stopped mid-sentence in a conversation with two men she didn't recognize, and his attention, which was already the most focused thing she had encountered in a human being, sharpened further in a way that was entirely visible and not at all subtle for a man who was professionally subtle. He excused himself and came to her. "You look—" He stopped. "I know," she said, and smiled. He offered her his arm, a gesture that was formal and somehow also not, and she took it, and they moved through the room together in the specific way that two people who know each other well but are carefully navigating the terms of that knowing move. Close without touching more than necessary, attuned to each other without performance. She met four people whose names she recognized from news she had read about the city's real power structure, two of whom she was relatively certain were the kind of men you read about in federal indictments. She was charming and composed and learned more from watching how Nico related to each of them than she had from anything Petra's briefings might have said. The gradations of his respect, the deliberateness of what he showed and what he withheld, the economy of the whole performance. At some point in the evening, a woman approached them, late 40s, Italian, stunning in the aggressive way of someone who had always used beauty as a weapon and had never found a reason to stop. She greeted Nico with a familiarity that was aimed at Alara like an arrow. "Nico," she took his hand. "You've been invisible." "Valeria." His voice was polite and absolutely without warmth. "You know how the season is." Valeria's eyes moved to Alara with an assessment that managed to be simultaneously respectful and threatening. "And this must be—" "Alara Voss," Alara said, extending her own hand, keeping her voice easy. "I'm the architect for the lower-level expansion." "How lovely." The word was pleasant and carried multiple meanings. Nico always does choose the finest for his projects. "I appreciate it," Alara said. "The space has been an extraordinary one to work in." Later, when Valeria had moved away, Nico's hand found the small of her back. A brief, light pressure, contact maintained for perhaps 3 seconds and then released. "Former arrangement," he said quietly. "Nothing current." "I didn't ask," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't need to." They were on the balcony at 11 p.m., a narrow space above the main floor, accessible by a back stair, looking out over the room below. She had come out for air, briefly, and he had followed with 2 glasses of wine. "Do you like it?" he asked. "The party or the space?" "Both. The space is extraordinary." She sipped the wine. "The party is extraordinary in the way of things that are beautiful and somewhat lethal." "Accurate." He leaned on the railing beside her. "You move through it well." "I grew up in Bridgeport," she said. "I know how to read a room." "You always did." He turned his glass in his hands. "You used to name everyone in the neighborhood, what they were to each other, what they wanted. You'd meet someone once and tell me later exactly who they were." She looked at him. The city was visible through the windows of the lower level. She could see the street, the winter-stripped trees, the passing headlights of late traffic. "I missed you," she said. The words came out simply, without the armor she'd been careful to wear, and she let them be simple. He was very still. "Ilara, I'm not asking for anything," she said. "I'm just saying the true thing." He turned to face her fully, and his expression, the full, unguarded expression, not the managed surface but the thing underneath, was the most difficult thing she had ever looked at, because it was the expression of a man who had been carrying a great weight for a very long time and had not been permitted to set it down. "I missed you every day," he said. "Every single day." The balcony was narrow, and the room was below them, and Chicago was through the glass, and she leaned forward and pressed her lips very briefly to his jaw, not the scar, but just beside it, and then she straightened and picked up her wine. "Come on," she said. "Your gala needs its host." He breathed. He straightened. He looked at her with eyes that contained something she recognized as her own answer, reflected. "Yes," he said. "Let's go." It came to a head in January. She had known it would. There was something inexorable about the Dominelli situation that she had been aware of beneath the ongoing work, beneath the gradual, careful shift in what she and Nico were to each other, a pressure building toward event. She was at the firm when Marco called. Not her, he called Thomas, because Nico had asked that any urgent situation be channeled through the professional relationship to avoid alarming her directly. A piece of consideration that she would have found patronizing from anyone else, and from Nico found merely characteristic. Thomas knocked on the frame of her office door with an expression that was professionally neutral, in the careful way of someone who was not entirely comfortable with what he was about to say. The Nero project has had a development. Mr. Valerio is asking that you come in today. He's sending a car. Is the building okay? The building is fine. Thomas paused. There was an incident last night involving some of the contractors. Two of them, the subcontractor team from the East Corridor, were approached. Intimidated. One of them is in the hospital with minor injuries. He said this in the tone of a man who wanted this conversation to be about architecture and was doing his best. The implication was that the project should stop. She was already reaching for her coat. The car that arrived was not the usual discreet black Escalade. It was heavier, 2 vehicles, 4 men total, Marco driving the lead car personally. She noticed but did not comment. At the Meridian Tower, she was taken up in the private elevator without ceremony. Nico was in his office, on a call that he ended when she came in. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that came from one bad night, but the compressed, controlled tiredness of someone managing multiple, simultaneous, high-pressure situations. There was a small cut above his left eyebrow, recent. "You were in it last night," she said, not quite a question. "Yes." "The contractors?" "Being compensated. They're off the project, by their own choice, which is the correct choice." He moved around the desk. "The project isn't stopping." "I know it isn't," she set her bag down. "What do you need from me?" Something in him shifted slightly at this, the directness of it perhaps, the absence of the argument about her safety that he had expected. "The site needs to be evaluated before we can bring in a replacement crew. I want your read on whether the East Corridor's work survived." "Okay." She went to the lower level, and the site, and it had. She walked every inch of it with the precision of someone who had committed the entire design to memory, and the work was intact, and she reported this to Nico in the text message she sent as she was heading back up, and his response was, "Good, come upstairs." Upstairs was the penthouse. She found him at the kitchen counter with a glass of water, the jacket off, the tiredness more visible. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen island and waited. "Dominelli is finished," he said. She absorbed this. What does that mean? It means he's out of Chicago by end of month, or certain information about his operations reaches parties he can't afford to have it reach. The flatness of his voice was not cruelty, it was precision. No violence, he's not worth the complications. And his people, the ones who hurt the contractor? Being dealt with through channels that don't require anything from you. She looked at him. When does it end? The management of the situation, all of it. Is there always a Dominelli? Yes, he said without hesitation. There is always something. This is the world I'm in. I know that. I want you to know it clearly, not in the abstract, not... He stopped. Started again, in the way he did when the thing he was about to say had been prepared carefully. I want you to know that choosing to be near me means choosing to be near this. I won't hide that from you. She set down her water glass. I grew up in Bridgeport, she said, for the second time in as many months. I know what the second economy is. I always have. That's different from living inside it. I know. She met his eyes. I'm not making any decisions tonight. I'm saying I'm not naive, and I'm not going to pretend I am. She stood. The replacement contractors. I have a crew I've worked with on 3 previous projects. They're good, and they're discreet, and they don't ask questions that aren't about the work. Send me their information. I will. She picked up her bag. He came around the counter, and for a moment they were close. Close enough that the space between them had the quality of something about to resolve, and she was aware of his warmth in the cold, precise air of the penthouse kitchen. She looked up at him. The cut above your eye needs to be cleaned, she said. Where's your first aid kit? A pause. Under the bathroom sink. Sit down. He sat, which was, in its own way, the most remarkable thing that had happened today, and she went and found the kit and came back and stood in front of him with antiseptic and gauze and cleaned the cut with the careful hands of a woman who had once bandaged herself and him on the fire escape after a badly managed climb to the roof, 3 decades and another lifetime ago. His hands rested on his knees, and he was very still, and she could feel him not touching her with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of touch. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "Hand me the tape." February, and the lower level was almost done. She walked through it on a Tuesday afternoon with the satisfaction of completion building in her. The threshold arch complete, the corridor sequence exactly what she'd imagined. The space below having its own identity while remaining in genuine conversation with the floor above. She had built a journey. She had built a descent that felt like arrival. An underground space that was not oppressive, but intimate, that made the people in it feel held rather than buried. She stood at the center of the main event space, the floor she designed with a pattern of dark oak and pale stone, alternating in a radial geometry, and looked up at the ceiling she'd recommended, matte black with embedded lights that could be adjusted from cold blue to amber gold. And she felt the things she always felt when a design resolved correctly. And this time it was doubled by the specificity of the space, by what the building was and who it belonged to. She heard him come in behind her. "Done," she said. He walked to the center of the floor and stood beside her and looked up at the ceiling. "It's extraordinary," he said. "I know." He looked at her sideways, and the small movement at the corner of his mouth was, she was certain now, a smile. "You know." "I worked very hard on it." "You did." He looked back up. "Ilara." "We're not having the conversation in the finished space," she said. "That's mine. I want to keep this one clean." "Fair." He was quiet for a moment. "Dinner. Tonight. Not Nero. Somewhere else. Somewhere that doesn't belong to you." He considered. "There's a place in Andersonville. The owner has nothing to do with any of my business. That bar is lower than I'd prefer, but I'll accept it." He laughed, actually laughed, a quiet sound but real, and she turned to look at him because she hadn't heard that in 28 years of knowing him in some configuration, and it was the same laugh. That was the unbearable thing. It was the same low, slightly startled laugh of a boy who had been very serious most of the time and had found something actually funny. 7 o'clock, she said. 7 o'clock. Dinner in Andersonville, a small Italian place with red-checked tablecloths and a wine list that was not curated, and she arrived first and was sitting with a glass of Chianti when he came in. He was in a gray sweater and dark pants, no suit, no jacket, the most casual she had ever seen him in public, and the casualness of it was in its way more intimate than anything that had preceded it. He sat down across from her, and for a moment they just looked at each other in the candlelight, and the restaurant was warm around them, and the city was February dark outside, and she thought, here we are. "Tell me about New York," she said. He told her. Not the operational history, not tonight, not here, but the texture of it. What it had been like to live in a city that was not Chicago, to build something from the ground up with people he didn't fully trust yet, to go to bed in hotel rooms for 2 years before he had a permanent address again. He talked about what he read during that time, the books that had organized his thinking. He talked about a woman in New York, briefly, without evasion, who had been real and who had ended when she understood that the thing most present in his life was absent, which was to say, it was someone else. She knew, Ilara said. She guessed. She was very perceptive. He turned his wineglass. She said, and I think she was right, that she was comfortable being someone's present, but she wasn't willing to be someone's substitute. Ilara was quiet. "Is that what I am?" she said. "What you've been building toward?" "No," he said, with the directness she had learned was his form of intimacy. "You're what everything else was the substitute for." The candle between them was small and steady, and the room was warm. "Tell me something you want," she said. "Not related to me. Something you want for yourself." He thought about this genuinely, which she had learned to recognize, the particular quality of his attention when it was engaged with a question he hadn't pre-prepared the answer to. "A house," he said. "An actual house. Not a penthouse. Something with a yard. Something that doesn't require security infrastructure to feel livable." "That's very normal." "I'm aware." "And you want that?" "I've wanted it for 3 years." He looked at her. I haven't done anything about it because it didn't make sense to want it alone. She let the sentence exist without rushing to fill it. The community center, she said after a moment. The one I designed when I was 18. For the neighborhood. I remember. I still have the drawings. I know, I've seen them. She stared at him. How? Your portfolio, from your second year of architecture school. You submitted it to 3 firms and all 3 put it on file. I may have accessed it. He said this with a quality that was as close to sheepish as she imagined he came. Years ago. Nico. I'm aware that's obsessive, she said. That's obsessive. Yes. Did you read my thesis? A pause. Oh my God, she said. It was an excellent thesis. It was a personal thesis about the ethics of architecture in gentrifying neighborhoods. It was not written for... She stopped, because she was laughing, which had not been anticipated, which was the honest truth of the evening surfacing despite itself. You are... I know what I am, he said, and his eyes were warm in the candlelight, warm in the way she had always known they were capable of being, underneath everything else. Tell me what you are, she said. Yours, he said. Probably since the sidewalk. She breathed. Probably since the L platform, she said. March arrived, and with it the opening of the lower level, and Alara's name in the Tribune's style section in a brief item about Nero's expansion that described the architectural design as intimately ambitious. She read this on her phone on a Tuesday morning and showed it to Cassie, who said, Intimately ambitious is absolutely how I would describe what's happening with you and the scary Italian man. And Alara threw a dish towel at her. Cassie had come to dinner with them the previous week, a casual thing, in Wicker Park, the 4 of them. Cassie had brought her girlfriend, whose name was Priya, and who was a physician, and who looked at Nico with the specific assessment of someone running a very thorough diagnostic. And the evening had been... good. Unexpectedly, uncomplicated in the moment good. Nico had talked to Priya about hospital administration with the fluency of someone who had, apparently, spent time thinking about healthcare systems, and Cassie had looked at Alara across the table with an expression that said a considerable number of things at once. He's not what I expected, Cassie said afterward. What did you expect? Less normal? More conspicuously dangerous? He's still conspicuously dangerous, Alara said. He's just also other things. Yeah. Cassie had been quiet for a moment. Are you being careful? In what sense? In every sense, but especially your heart. I don't know, Alara said honestly. I don't know if being careful is still an option. Cassie had hugged her then, which was its own kind of answer. She was in the penthouse on a Sunday evening in March when the second crisis arrived. Not Dominelli. Dominelli had been resolved, was gone, had taken his organization's diminished remains to another city and another set of arrangements. This was different. She knew something was wrong by the quality of Nico's stillness. She had been reading on his couch. She had been reading on his couch with increasing frequency, and the books she borrowed were kept on a separate shelf, and the presence of her coffee cup in his cabinet was a thing neither of them had commented on, when his phone buzzed 3 times in rapid succession, and the quality of the air in the room changed. He looked at the phone. He stood. He went to the window. I need to make some calls, he said. Okay. She kept her eyes on her book. It may take a while. I'll be here. He looked at her then. A quick, involuntary look, the kind that came before the managed version, and something in it was raw in the way of something being checked. I'll be here. 3 words and what they meant in the context of his particular history with departure. I'll be in the other room, he said. She heard him on the phone, not the words. He was speaking Italian, low, the rapid Italian of urgent conversation, rather than the deliberate Italian of formal communication. She heard it go on for 40 minutes. She read her book and listened with a peripheral awareness that was attentive without being intrusive. He came back in at 9 p.m. He sat on the other end of the couch and ran both hands through his hair, which was the most physically disheveled she had ever seen him. Tell me, she said. One of my operations in Detroit has been compromised. A man named Ferretti, I've worked with him for 4 years, has been talking to federal investigators. She absorbed this. How bad? Manageable, but it requires restructuring. Things I built to be stable are going to need to be taken apart and rebuilt. Can you do that? Yes. He didn't hesitate. He was not afraid. She understood that he was past fear in the conventional sense, had been past it for years, that his relationship with risk was something different from fear, something more like calculation. It's costly. Time, resources, some relationships. How long? Months. She set down her book and turned to face him more fully. Is this going to put the project at risk? He looked at her. The Nero project is protected. Everything related to the legitimate businesses is firewalled. I'm not asking about the project because I'm worried about the project, she said. I'm asking about the project because it's the proxy for the question I'm actually asking. He was quiet for a moment. Are you going to have to disappear again? He said. Yes, she said. That is the actual question. He reached forward and took her hand, which was the first time, the actual first time, not the handshake at the meeting or the brief pressure at the gala, not the bandaging of the cut. The first time he had taken her hand with the deliberate intention of holding it. No, he said, I'm not disappearing again. She looked at his hand around hers. The same hands, older, bearing the evidence of more and harder living, but the same warmth, the same careful grip. Promise me, she said. I promise you, he said. She leaned forward and put her forehead against his shoulder, and he went very still, and then his other arm came around her in the careful, deliberate way of a man who had been holding himself at a distance from something for a very long time, and was releasing that hold, slowly, because slow was the only safe speed. They stayed like that for a while, in the penthouse, 52 floors above the city, not speaking. Outside, March was doing what March did, cold and gray and occasionally luminous. And Chicago was Chicago, full of all its particular negotiations between what people built and what they became. And in the stillness of the room, the city went on below them like a score being performed. And for the first time in a long time, she did not need to be anywhere else. April. She had been bringing him coffee in the mornings. This was not a large thing in itself. She was there most mornings now for the final phase of the project installation, and she had found the French press early on and established an opinion about the grind. And somewhere in the past month, the morning coffee had become something she made without being asked, and he received without comment, which was its own kind of language. She had not moved in. The studio in Pilsen was still hers, the radiator still clanging its particular nocturnal percussion. But the shelf in the penthouse had 3 more books on it with her name on the fly pages, and there was a second toothbrush in the bathroom, and her architectural drawings had been given their own corner of the work table that was not cleared when she left. The city was thawing. Chicago's spring, when it came, was a specific and unreliable gift. Warmth one day, sleet the next, and then suddenly a morning when the air carried something through the cold that was unmistakably vegetable and alive. The city's perennial refusal to remain winter. She stood at the window on one such morning, a Sunday, early, before the city was fully awake, with her coffee, watching the light come up over the lake. The lake was something different in spring, the heavy winter gray peeling back to a color between steel and blue, restless, the whitecaps kicked up by the April wind. She heard him come up behind her. She expected him to stop at a distance. There was still, even now, a carefulness in him around physical space, an old discipline of restraint that had not fully dissolved. He didn't stop. He came to stand directly behind her, close, and his arms came around her from behind, and his chin came to rest on top of her head, and she felt the full length of him against her back, solid and warm, and she let out a breath that had, she realized, been held for a very long time. The lake looks different in April, she said. Everything looks different in April. They watched the light change over the water. She put her free hand over his where it rested on the window glass. I forgive you, she said. I've been waiting for the right moment, and I think this is it. He was very still. I haven't earned that, he said, after a moment. Not fully. I'm not giving it to you because you've earned it, she said. I'm giving it to you because I've been carrying it, and it's time to put it down. She turned, half turning, enough to see his face from this angle. Not forgiving you was keeping me at a distance from the part of this that I actually want. I don't want to stay at a distance anymore. He looked at her with those dark eyes, and they were full of something she recognized as the specific vulnerability of a man who was very powerful and very protected, and was, in this moment, entirely neither. "Elara," he said. "I know," she said. "Me too." He kissed her forehead, then her temple, then her cheek. And then she turned fully, and his mouth found hers, and it was the first time, and also not the first time, was the continuation of something that had begun on a Bridgeport sidewalk with gravel in her palm, and a boy who said, "I notice things," and the continuation of it felt like the threshold arch, like the moment of passage made legible, the arrival after a long descent. They stood at the window for a while after, the lake doing its April thing below them, and the city waking up around the tower, and the coffee going cold on the counter. She told her mother. Not the full history. Her mother's grasp of full histories was intermittent now, the cognitive threads following their own path. But the essential thing, the thing her mother would understand. "I found him again," she said, sitting in the chair beside her mother's bed at the Skokie facility, in the room with the window and the afternoon light. Her mother turned from the window. Her eyes, which were still entirely her eyes, were alert in the particular way that mattered. "The boy," her mother said. "Yes. The dark-eyed one, from the street." "Yes." Her mother was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the clear assessment of a woman who had raised her alone and had therefore learned to see her very well. "Is he kind to you?" she asked. Elara thought about this with the honesty the question deserved. "Yes," she said, "in complicated ways, but yes." Her mother reached out and took her hand. Her hand was smaller than Elara remembered, lighter, but the grip was still sure. "That's all that matters," she said. She told Nico, later, what her mother had said. He was quiet for a moment. "She's right," he said. "She usually is." He had been doing something on his phone, but he set it down. "I'd like to meet her. When you think when you think it's right." "She'd like that." She glanced at him. "She'll ask you directly if you're kind to me." "I know." "She won't accept anything but a direct answer." "I'll give her one," he said, simply. She believed him. The federal situation did not resolve cleanly, as federal situations rarely did. May brought a subpoena, not to Nico directly, but to Meridian Holdings, a broad-scope request for financial records related to a 2-year-old transaction that was technically legal and practically a lever. His lawyers were among the best in Chicago, which was to say, among the best in the country for this particular category of work, and they managed the process with the precision of surgeons. But it was months of process, months of managed risk, months of controlled uncertainty. She watched him navigate it with the specific attention she brought to everything about him now, the way the pressure organized rather than disorganized him, the way he came home on bad days, not angry, but quieter, the quality of that quiet, different from his usual quality of quiet, a measure of how much he was containing. One night in May, he came home from a meeting with his attorneys, and she had dinner ready. Not elaborate, pasta and bread and wine, the simplest things. And he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table and at her with an expression that was not complex, actually, for once. Was straightforwardly and simply moved. "You don't have to. I wanted to," she said. "Sit down." He sat. They ate. He talked about the meeting, not the legal specifics, which would have taken hours to explain, but the broad shape of it, the strategic position, what he thought the next 6 weeks looked like. She listened and asked questions and noted things that seemed to need noting, and the normalcy of it, the domesticity of two people sharing a meal over a complicated situation, was the best thing, she thought, she had experienced in a long time. "The Ferretti testimony," he said, toward the end of the bottle. "I want you to know, if it goes further than the subpoena, if this becomes something public, your name is completely clean. I've made certain of it. There is no connection, anywhere in any document or record, between you and anything I do that isn't entirely above board." She looked at him. "You're protecting the escape route." "I'm protecting you." "What if I don't want the escape route?" He set down his glass. "Elara, I'm not being reckless," she said. "I'm saying, when you look at this situation, look at it with me in it, not with me as something to be firewalled." The candlelight was steady between them. He looked at her for a long time. That's new territory for me, he said. I know. She refilled his glass. I'm not asking you to change the infrastructure overnight. I'm asking you to let me be in the room when we're talking about the situation, instead of protecting me from the room. Some of what's in the room is... I know what's in the room, she said. Tell me anyway. He told her. The Ferretti testimony, as it stood, implicated 3 of his mid-level operations, distribution networks that were running under legitimate business fronts in the logistics sector. The subpoena was a fishing exercise, Nico's lawyers believed. The federal investigators didn't have enough to build a case, and they were hoping to catch something useful in the document request that they hadn't already known to look for. The risk was manageable. The timeline was 6 to 9 months. At the end of it, he expected the investigation to close without action. The risk it was not manageable against was a second Ferretti, someone inside the organization who decided, for reasons of fear or money or conviction, to provide information more directly useful than what the document request could uncover.
Can you identify the risk points? She asked.
Yes. And address them. Yes, I have people working on that. Okay. She folded her hands on the table. Then that's what you do. And while you're doing it, tell me what you need. He looked at her. The direct look, the full look. The one without the managed surface. And what it held was not just love, though it held that. It was something more foundational than love, more structural. The specific gratitude of a person who has spent a very long time being alone in the room with the full truth of themselves, and has been found there by someone who did not flinch. This, he said, this is what I need. She picked up her wine. Then you have it. The subpoena resolved in August, as Nico's lawyers had predicted. The document request produced nothing actionable, the investigation was restructured away from Meridian Holdings, and the federal file on the matter was quietly deprioritized in the way that federal priorities shifted with resources and political wins and the accumulation of more urgent things. The morning the news came, he told her over breakfast in the penthouse kitchen, and she said good and refilled her coffee. And he looked at her and said, "That's all?" And she said, "That's all. It's resolved. What do you want to do this weekend?" And he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, with the small, real smile that she had learned to look for, "I want to see the lake." "Then let's go to the lake." They went to the lake. It was August, and the lakefront was full of the particular democracy of a city's summer. Every kind of person, every kind of activity, the whole brilliant, ordinary spectacle of Chicago doing what it did. They walked north along the path for 2 hours, and she held his hand, and he was, she thought, as close to simply present as she had seen him. The full weight of what he was, and what he'd built, and what it cost, temporarily suspended in the August light. September, and she took him to Bridgeport. He had not been back. She had said, one evening in August, "I want to show you something." And he had said, "What?" And she had said, "Where we came from, with different eyes." And he had been quiet for a long moment before he said yes. They went on a Saturday morning, not in one of the black Escalades, in Alara's own car, a second-hand Subaru with a cracked dashboard and a working heater and a remarkable ability to find every pothole on the south side, which made Nico hold the grip above the window door with the controlled expression of a man deciding whether to comment. She drove them down South Halsted, and the neighborhood met them, changed and the same, the way neighborhoods were, the decades of change visible in layers if you knew where to look. New construction alongside the unchanged, the old bodega gone, a coffee shop in its place, the church still there, the park still there, the particular angle of autumn light on the brick buildings of a Chicago neighborhood being exactly what it had always been. She parked and they walked. She took him to the building where they'd both grown up, standing across the street looking up at it. The fire escape where they'd climbed to the roof was still there, rusted somewhat, less certain looking than she remembered. The window of her mother's apartment on the 3rd floor. "I used to watch the street from there," she said, "after you left, for a while." He stood beside her without speaking. "Not looking for you," she said, "just keeping the habit of looking out." "Ilara, I'm not saying it to hurt you," she said. "I'm saying it because it's part of the real story, and I want us to know the real story. Both of us." He nodded. She took him to the library next, the the branch library on South Morgan, where they had done homework on winter evenings and where she had, at 17, kissed him for the first time, in the stacks between biographies and natural science, and they had looked at each other afterward with the specific alarm of two people who have just made something irreversible. The library was the same. Different furniture, same light, same high windows. They walked between the stacks without talking, and she felt him adjusting something, felt it in the quality of his silence, which was processing rather than managing. Sitting with the place and what it meant. Outside, on the steps, he said, "I should have come back sooner." "You came back when you could come back cleanly," she said. "Or as close to cleanly as your situation allowed." "That's more generous than I deserve." "Probably." She sat on the library steps, looking at the street. "But I've been thinking about what it took. Not the decision, which I still think was wrong. I still think you should have told me. But the weight of it. Carrying it for 9 years. Doing all of it alone." He sat beside her. "You don't have to carry things alone anymore," she said. "I'm saying that clearly, not as a romantic declaration, though it is that. As a fact. I'm here. You don't have to do it alone." He looked at her for a long time. "The house," he said. "I've been looking at houses." She turned to face him fully. "Have you?" "In Logan Square. There's a brownstone. It needs work, significant work." "The bones are right." He watched her face. "I thought you might want to see it." She felt the smile arrive before she could organize it. A brownstone. With a yard. A small yard, but a yard. "And you want my professional opinion." "I want your professional opinion," he said. "And your personal one." She stood. "Show me the listing." He pulled out his phone, and they sat on the library steps of their childhood neighborhood while he showed her a 1920s brownstone in Logan Square with original windows and a backyard that needed work and an interior that needed everything. And she looked at it with the eyes of a woman who saw what buildings could be rather than what they were. And she said, "The light on the 3rd floor would be extraordinary." "I thought so too," he said.
When can we see it?
"I have the key." She looked at him. "You already have the key. I bought it last month." "Nico, I wanted to make sure no one else could buy it first." She stood. "Take me to see the brownstone." He stood too, and offered her his arm in the slightly formal way he sometimes did, which she had come to understand as his version of tenderness, the careful, deliberate gesture that meant something more than it looked. And she took it, and they walked to his car in the September light. The city around them was gold and copper at the edges, the trees turning, Chicago doing its October approaching thing, the air carrying that particular end-of-summer clarity that never lasted long enough. She thought, "I am 30 years old, and I am walking through the neighborhood where I grew up with a man I have known since I was 15, and he has a brownstone in Logan Square with original windows and terrible bones and a small yard, and the future is not the terrifying open question it was a year ago." She thought, this is what it was for, all of it, even the long way around. October. The brownstone was being renovated, which she was overseeing with the same precision she brought to everything. And the ongoing relationship between the architect and the man who owned the building was a source of considerable amusement to the construction crew, who were professional enough not to comment on the specific quality of the arguments about load-bearing walls and the historic preservation requirements for the original windows. The arguments, it should be noted, were productive ones, the kind you had when both people in the room were intelligent and had strong opinions, and were secure enough in the relationship to hold positions. She won most of them, because she was usually right, and he conceded most of them with the particular grace of a man who had found that being wrong in this context felt less like loss than like something he had been waiting for. The penthouse was still his primary residence during the renovation, hers too in practice, though the studio in Pilsen was maintained as a professional address, and occasionally as a place she retreated to when she needed quiet that was specifically her own. This was fine. He understood it. He had spent years building a self that was precisely bounded, and he recognized and respected the same in her. They had the ceremony in November, which was Nico's choice. Not a ceremony for anyone else, not a public announcement, not a party. He brought her to Nero on a Tuesday evening when it was closed, the main floor empty, just the two of them and the filament ceiling and the bar with its amber light. He brought out a box. He was not, she noted, a man who made gestures of this kind with any theatrical embellishment. The box appeared from his jacket pocket with the same directness he brought to everything, and set it on the bar between them. She looked at it, looked at him. "This isn't—" "It's not what the box implies," he said. "Open it." She opened it. Inside, nested in dark velvet, was a key. Old, iron, the kind of key that belonged to a door from a century ago. She picked it up. It was warm from his pocket. "The front door," he said. "The original key, from the brownstone's original lock. The locksmith found it in the building's records." A pause. "The lock has been rekeyed to match. The new keys are the same design." She held the key in her palm, heavy, specific, the shape of something real. "You gave me the key," she said. "I'm giving you the key," he corrected, "not the building. The building is already yours, in every way that matters. This is just—" He paused, looking for the word with the care he brought to words. "The physical version of what's been true for a while." She looked at the key, and at him, and at the empty, beautiful room around them. The room she had designed, the space she had made into something she was proud of, in the building of the man who was the first person she had ever loved, and who had spent 9 years becoming someone powerful enough to be the person she deserved. "I became the devil," she said quietly, "just so I could build a sanctuary for my angel." He looked at her, startled, not by the words, but by the fact that she had found them. "Something like that," he said. "You should have told me," she said, one last time, not with anger, with the simplicity of a truth that would always be part of the story. "You should have trusted me." "I know," he said. "I should have." "And next time, any version of next time, any version of a situation where the choice seems to be between protecting me and being honest with me, I tell you," he said. "I tell you, and we face it together." She turned the key in her hand. "Good." She stepped forward and kissed him, not the careful, exploratory kisses of spring, but something with more certainty in it, more full arrival, the kiss of two people who have finished the long approach and are at last exactly where they are. His arms came around her, and the room held them in its amber light, and somewhere above them the city was doing all its complicated, beautiful, ongoing work, building and tearing down and building again, full of the specific ambition and grief and hope of any city that has been made by people who wanted something and were willing to pay for it. She moved into the brownstone in December, when the 3rd floor was finished, her office, the one with the light she'd said would be extraordinary, which was, in practice, exactly as extraordinary as she had predicted. She stood in the empty room on the first morning, the December light coming in through the original windows, the city visible between the buildings of Logan Square in the middle distance, the sound of the neighborhood below, traffic and someone's music and a dog and the city's particular continuous hum. She set up her drafting table by the window. She arranged her pencils. She put the drawings she had made at 18, the community center, the imagined building for the neighborhood, on the wall above the table. She still had those drawings. She had always had them. She was 30 years old, and she was an architect, and she was building things that lasted. He found her there in the afternoon. She had been working for hours, absorbed in a new project, and hadn't heard him come up. He stood in the doorway, looking at her and the light and the drawings on the wall, and his expression was the full, unguarded one, the one she'd been learning to read and never entirely tired of, the one that contained the whole complicated history of what it had taken to get here and what it was worth. "The drawings are up," he said. "They should have been somewhere real for a long time," she said. He came into the room and stood beside her and looked at the drawings, the community center, 18-year-old Ilara's vision of what a building could do for a place. "We could build it," he said. She looked at him. "The community center," he said. "Bridgeport. The neighborhood needs— it always needed what you designed. We have the resources. We have the architect." A pause. "We have the reason." She looked at the drawings for a long time, the young version of herself, visible in every line, in the idealism of the design, in the belief that architecture could be the shape of what a community wanted to be. "We'd have to do it clean," she said. The funding, the build, all of it, completely above board. No connections to anything that doesn't bear scrutiny. I know, he said. That's possible. It would take restructuring some of how I operate. It's been underway, the restructuring. This is the direction I'm going. She looked at him. This was new, and also not new. She had seen it in increments over the months. The careful, deliberate shift in the composition of what Nico Valerio was. The legitimate side growing, the other side being not erased, because that was not how the world worked, but gradually, methodically reduced, the weight of it shifting. You're getting out, she said. Getting out entirely doesn't happen overnight, he said carefully. It doesn't happen without cost. But, yes, that's the direction. She breathed. She turned back to the drawings. The community center, she said. Yes. With the rooftop garden. Yes. She picked up her pencil. Then let's start, she said. Outside, December was doing December things. Cold and clear and occasionally magnificent. The kind of day that arrived in Chicago like a gift you hadn't earned and didn't want to waste. The brownstone's small yard held the remnants of a garden she was planning in her head. Something hardy and seasonal. Something that would survive the winters. Upstairs, in the room with the extraordinary light, an architect was designing a building for the neighborhood where she had grown up. A building that had existed in her imagination for 12 years and was finally going to be real. Downstairs, a man who had taught himself to be dangerous was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a structural report for the community center site, reading it with the same precise attention he had once given to a different kind of report, and the shift in what that attention was applied to felt like, and was, a beginning. The scars were still there, on his arms, on his jaw, in the parts of both of them that the years had marked. Scars didn't go. They were not supposed to go. They were the evidence of the distance traveled, the proof that the body and the self had sustained things and kept moving. Old scars and sunshine. That was the whole of it. That was the story. The city outside was full of people navigating the same negotiation, between the dark and the light, between the damage already done and the building still possible, between the versions of themselves they had been and the versions they were still becoming. And in the brownstone in Logan Square, with its original windows and its small yard and its third-floor room with the extraordinary light, two people who had loved each other young and lost each other in the complicated way that the world arranged those losses, and found their way back through the long and difficult country of their separate lives. Those two people were at the beginning of something. Not perfect, not without cost, not without the awareness, held in the honest light, of everything it had taken and everything that remained to be done. But real, and beginning. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.